The cardboard box felt heavier than it should have, considering everyone else had walked past it without a second glance. I'd paid $12 for what my sister Jessica called Grandma Dot's dusty old mess, and honestly, I wasn't even sure why. Maybe it was the way the afternoon sunlight caught the corner of an old leather journal peeking out from beneath a pile of yellowed photographs, or maybe it was just stubbornness. The kind that had kept me coming back to visit Grandma every Sunday when the rest of the family had given up, claiming she'd gotten too strange in her final years. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Now, 3 weeks after her funeral, I was standing in the Cedar Falls Community Center watching strangers rifle through her belongings like vultures. My father stood near the cash box, efficiently processing transactions with the same businesslike manner he used for his accounting clients. My mother hovered nearby, apologizing to buyers for the condition of various items. And Jessica, perfectly polished in her designer blazer despite it being a Saturday morning, kept checking her phone and sighing about how long this was taking. But that box called to me, something about the way it sat slightly apart from the other items, as if Grandma had positioned it there intentionally. The handwritten label on the side, in Dot's careful script, simply read Sarah's things, which was impossible, because I'd never left anything at her house. At least, nothing I could remember. The drive home from the estate sale should have been a victory lap. I'd managed to rescue a piece of Grandma Dot from the feeding frenzy, even if it was just a box of what Jessica had loudly proclaimed to be absolute junk that nobody in their right mind would want. But instead of satisfaction, I felt the familiar hollow ache that had become my constant companion since losing my teaching job 3 months ago. The same feeling that intensified every time I had to explain to someone why I was living in a studio apartment at 32, while my younger sister owned a 4-bedroom colonial in the Columbus suburbs. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and I've been the family's afterthought for as long as I can remember. Not the successful one that was Jessica with her marketing director title and her perfect husband David. Not the reliable one that was Dad with his steady accounting practice that had supported 3 generations of Mitchells. Not even the nurturing one. Mom had claimed that role years ago, though her nurturing seemed to flow exclusively toward Jessica and her achievements. I was just Sarah, the one who chose teaching over business, who never married, who spent her Sundays sitting with an increasingly eccentric elderly woman while everyone else found better things to do. Grandma Dot's house on Maple Street had been my refuge growing up. While Jessica was busy with cheerleading practice and honor society meetings, I would slip away to the old Victorian with its wraparound porch and rooms full of mysterious objects. Dot never treated me like I was lacking something essential. She would make us tea in delicate china cups that she claimed had belonged to her grandmother, and we would sit in her cluttered living room while she told stories about the various treasures she'd collected over the years. My family had always considered Dot's collecting habit to be evidence of her declining mental state. "She's becoming a hoarder," my mother would whisper to my father when they thought I wasn't listening. "Someone needs to talk to her about all that clutter." But I never saw clutter when I looked around Dot's house. I saw stories. Every ornate picture frame held a memory. Every stack of books represented hours of escape. Every piece of costume jewelry had once made someone feel beautiful. The day she died, I was the one who found her. I'd arrived for our usual Sunday visit to discover her peacefully sitting in her favorite armchair, looking out the window at the garden she'd tended for 40 years. The doctor said it had been quick, probably sometime during the night, but what haunts me wasn't the finding her, Mitchell. It was the realization that if I hadn't shown up that Sunday, she might have sat there alone for days before anyone noticed she was gone. My apartment felt smaller than usual when I finally made it home, the cardboard box taking up what seemed like half my available floor space. The late afternoon sun slanted through my single window, highlighting the dust motes that danced in the air like tiny spirits. I made myself a cup of coffee, instant, because the good stuff had become a luxury I couldn't afford, Mitchell, and sat cross-legged on my futon, staring at the box that had cost me $12. I probably shouldn't have spent. The label in Dot's handwriting seemed to mock me. Sarah's things. What things? I'd spent countless hours in her house over the years, but I'd never left belongings there. I'd been careful about that, actually. Some instinct had always told me not to leave traces of myself in places where I wasn't entirely sure I belonged. With hands that trembled slightly, whether from caffeine or nerves, I couldn't tell, I carefully lifted the lid. The first thing I saw was a photograph, and my breath caught in my throat. It was me, maybe 7 years old, sitting in Dot's garden with dirt on my knees and a gap-toothed grin. I was holding a small potted plant, beaming at the camera with the kind of uninhibited joy I couldn't remember feeling in years. But that wasn't what made my hands shake. It was that I had no memory of this photo being taken. Beneath the photograph was a stack of letters tied with a faded blue ribbon. My name was written on the envelopes in various handwritings. Some I recognized, others I didn't. The postmarks dated back years, some from when I was still in college. I untied the ribbon with careful fingers and opened the first envelope. It was from my elementary school principal, Mrs. Patterson, written on official school letterhead. "Dear Mrs. Mitchell," it began. "I wanted to personally thank you for your granddaughter Sarah's exceptional contribution to our school garden project. Her dedication and natural teaching ability with the younger students has been remarkable. Sarah has a gift for making learning come alive, and I hope you'll encourage her to consider education as a career path." I read the letter twice, then a third time. Mrs. Patterson had written to my grandmother about me. I tried to remember the school garden project, and could only recall vague images of helping kindergarteners plant seeds. It had seemed like such a small thing at the time, barely worth mentioning to my parents, who were busy celebrating Jessica's latest academic achievement. The next letter was from my high school English teacher, Mr. Rodriguez. He'd written to tell Dot about a poem I'd submitted to a national contest, a poem I'd forgotten I'd even written. According to the letter, it had placed third in the state competition. The prize announcement and certificate were tucked behind the letter, yellow with age. I had won third place in a state poetry contest, and I'd never known. Letter after letter revealed a pattern that made my chest tight with emotions I couldn't name. Teachers who had reached out to my grandmother to praise my work, to express concern when I seemed troubled, to share pride in my accomplishments. A guidance counselor who had written about my potential for leadership. A college professor who had wanted to recommend me for a special program. People who had seen something in me that I'd never seen in myself, who had tried to water seeds that had been planted in Dot's garden all those years ago. But why had these letters come to Dot instead of my parents? I found the answer in a note tucked between two envelopes, written in my grandmother's careful script. "Sarah's teachers know she needs someone who will truly listen. I asked them to share her achievements with me so she would know that someone was paying attention." The coffee in my cup had grown cold, as I sat surrounded by evidence of a life I had.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Known I was living. Dot had been collecting proof of my worth the way other people collected stamps or coins. She had been building a case for my value while I had been learning to accept that I didn't have any. Beneath the letters, I found a small leather journal with my initials embossed on the cover. I opened it carefully, expecting to find blank pages, but instead discovered Dot's handwriting documenting moments from our Sunday visits that I had long forgotten. "Sarah helped me reorganize the attic today. She has such gentle hands with fragile things." Sarah read to me from that poetry book. Her voice makes even the saddest poems sound hopeful. Sarah brought me soup when I was feeling poorly. She stayed until she was sure I was all right. Page after page of moments that had felt ordinary to me, but had obviously meant the world to her. She had been keeping a record of our relationship, preserving the memory of every kindness, every laugh, every quiet afternoon we'd shared. In her eyes I hadn't been an afterthought or a disappointment. I had been precious enough to document. The journal entries went back years, starting from when I was barely a teenager. "Sarah has such an old soul," read one entry from when I was 14. She understands that beautiful things don't always come in perfect packages. Another from my senior year of high school. Sarah will leave us soon for college, but I know she'll come back. Some people are born with roots that run deep. She had been right about that. Even when my parents suggested I find better things to do with my Sundays. Even when Jessica rolled her eyes and asked why I wasted so much time with crazy old Grandma Dot. I had kept coming back. Something in her house had fed a part of my soul that stayed hungry everywhere else. As the sun began to set outside my small window, casting long shadows across my apartment floor, I reached the last item in the box. It was a small velvet pouch, the kind that might hold jewelry. Inside I found a key old-fashioned and ornate, with a small tag attached that read "For the lock that matters most." I turned the key over in my palm, trying to understand what lock it might open. Dot's house had been cleared out completely for the estate sale. All the furniture had been tagged and sold, all the personal belongings sorted and distributed or discarded. What could this key possibly unlock? Then I remembered something that made my pulse quicken. Dot's old oak desk had been pushed against the wall during the estate sale, marked with a sold sticker, but I recalled from my childhood that the desk had a small hidden drawer, the kind you could only find if you knew where to press. Dot had shown it to me once when I was maybe 9 years old, making me promise never to tell anyone about it. She'd said it was where she kept the things too important to lose. The desk had been purchased by a local antique dealer who planned to restore it. If I could find him, if I could convince him to let me check that hidden drawer before he began working on the piece, maybe I would understand what this key was meant to unlock. Maybe I would discover what Dot had considered too important to lose. But first I needed to process what I had already found. I gathered the letters carefully, retying them with the blue ribbon, and placed them back in the box along with the journal and the mysterious key. Tomorrow, I would track down that antique dealer. Tomorrow, I would try to solve the puzzle Dot had left for me. Tonight I would sit in my small apartment and try to reconcile the person I thought I was with the person these letters and journal entries described. Somewhere between the Sarah who felt invisible and overlooked, and the Sarah who had been carefully documented and cherished, the truth was waiting to be discovered. The box sat beside my futon as I finally tried to sleep, containing not junk as my family had assumed, but evidence of a love story I was only beginning to understand. Dot had spent years collecting proof that I mattered, that I had value beyond what even I had recognized. The question now was whether I had the courage to believe her. Part 2. Character Foundation. Sleep came in fragments that night, interrupted by dreams where Dot sat in her garden pointing to flowers I couldn't quite see, her voice carrying words I couldn't quite hear. When morning finally arrived, gray and drizzling through my apartment window, I felt like I'd been wrestling with ghosts all night. The cardboard box sat exactly where I'd left it, but somehow it seemed to have grown heavier in the darkness, weighted with all the revelations it contained. I made coffee and toast, the same breakfast I'd eaten every morning since losing my job, but today even these simple tasks felt different. The person buttering this bread had won a state poetry contest. The hands holding this chipped mug had been praised by teachers for their gentleness and wisdom. According to the letters in that box, I wasn't just Sarah the unemployed teacher living in a studio apartment. I was Sarah the gifted educator, Sarah the compassionate granddaughter, Sarah worth documenting and remembering. But if that was true, why had it taken a cardboard box full of secrets to show me? The answer, I suspected, lay in the patterns that had shaped my family for as long as I could remember. Growing up in the Mitchell household had been like living in a solar system where Jessica was the sun, and the rest of us were planets orbiting around her bright, obvious achievements. Every dinner conversation revolved around her latest success. Every family gathering became a celebration of her newest accomplishment. She had been valedictorian while I graduated somewhere in the comfortable middle of my class. She had landed internships at prestigious companies, while I worked summers at the local library. She had married David, a successful architect, in a wedding that took 2 years to plan and cost more than I'd made in my first 3 years of teaching. I wasn't bitter about Jessica's success. Exactly. She had worked hard for everything she'd achieved, and she deserved recognition. But somewhere along the way, the family had developed a narrative where there was only room for one daughter to shine, and Jessica had claimed that space so completely that I had learned to make myself smaller, to fit in the remaining corners. My parents weren't cruel about it. They never said I was a disappointment, or that they wished I were different. But their attention flowed toward Jessica like water finding its natural course, and I had learned to expect the polite applause for my smaller victories, the distracted nods when I shared news about my life, the way conversations would shift back to Jessica before I'd finished speaking. Even my choice to become a teacher had been met with gentle concern rather than pride. "Are you sure you'll be able to support yourself on a teacher's salary?" my father had asked. "Maybe you should consider something with more stability," my mother had suggested. When I'd told them about getting my first teaching position at Roosevelt Elementary, Jessica had been there to announce her promotion to senior marketing coordinator on the same day. Guess which news dominated the dinner conversation? The irony was that I had loved teaching with a passion that surprised even me. Standing in front of a classroom full of 8-year-olds, watching their faces light up when they finally understood a concept that had been puzzling them, had felt like coming home to myself. I was good at it too, in ways that had nothing to do with Jessica or my parents' expectations. I knew how to reach the quiet kids who reminded me of myself, how to encourage the ones who struggled, how to challenge the ones who were ready for more. For 8 years, I had poured everything I had into those classrooms. I stayed late to tutor struggling students. I spent my own money on supplies. I attended every school play and science fair. I had thought I was making a difference, creating small ripples of change in the lives of the children who passed through my care. But when budget cuts forced the school to eliminate my position last spring, I had felt like I was disappearing entirely. Without the identity of Sarah the teacher, I wasn't sure who Sarah was supposed to be. The letters in Dot's box suggested that other people had seen me more clearly than I had seen myself. Mrs. Patterson, who had written about my natural teaching ability when I was barely out of elementary school myself. Mr. Rodriguez, who had recognized something worth celebrating in my poetry. The college professor who had wanted to recommend me for opportunities I had never even known existed. But why had these people written to Dot instead of sharing their praise directly with me or my parents? The answer, I was beginning to understand, had everything to do with who had been paying attention and who had not. Dot had been the one person in my family who listened when I talked, who remembered the small details of my life, who treated my thoughts and feelings as worthy of consideration. She had somehow communicated to my teachers and mentors that she was the adult in my life, who would truly hear what they had to say about me. Sitting in my small apartment with rain pattering against the window, I realized that Dot had been running interference for me for years. While my parents were focused on Jessica's achievements, Dot had been quietly collecting evidence of my worth. While I was learning to make myself invisible, she had been documenting proof that I deserved to be seen. The weight of that realization was almost unbearable. All those Sunday afternoons I had spent with her, thinking I was just keeping a lonely old woman company, she had been loving me in ways I was only beginning to understand. Every story she told, every cup of tea she poured, every moment she gave me her full attention had been an act of radical care, in a world that had taught me to expect less. I pulled the leather journal out of the box again, and opened it to a random page. "Sarah brought me wildflowers today," read an entry from 3 summers ago. She said they reminded her of the ones in the fairy tale books we used to read together. She has kept her sense of wonder despite everything. That's rarer than she knows. Despite everything. What had Dot meant by that? What had she seen that I hadn't been able to see myself? The phone rang, jarring me out of my thoughts. Jessica's name appeared on the screen, and I almost didn't answer, but curiosity won out over caution. "Sarah, thank goodness," she said without preamble. "I've been thinking about yesterday, and I feel terrible about some of the things I said. I know you loved Grandma Dot, and I shouldn't have called her stuff junk. The apology was so unexpected that I didn't know how to respond. Jessica rarely apologized for anything, and never for something as minor as dismissing Dot's belongings. "It's okay," I said automatically. "No, it's not. I've been stressed about the whole estate situation, but that's no excuse. David reminded me that you were the one who visited her every week, and you have just as much right to keep mementos as anyone else. Did you find anything interesting in that box you bought?" I looked at the collection of letters spread across my coffee table, at the journal full of Dot's careful observations, at the mysterious key that promised more secrets yet to be revealed. "Yes," I said. "I found some things I didn't expect." "Well, I'm glad. Listen, Mom wants to have everyone over for dinner Sunday. Sort of a memorial thing for Grandma. Will you come? And maybe you could bring whatever you found in the box. I think it would be nice to share some memories." The invitation was so normal, so much like the old Jessica who had once been my partner in mischief before she became my successful younger sister, that I almost said yes immediately. But something held me back. The letters had shown me that there was more to my relationship with Dot than my family had ever understood. Maybe there was more to me than they had ever understood too. "I'll think about it," I said. "Okay. But Sarah, I really am sorry about yesterday. And I'm sorry about your job situation. I know it's been hard." After she hung up, I sat staring at my phone for a long time. This was the most genuine conversation I'd had with Jessica in years, and it was happening now, the day after I'd discovered evidence that I was more than the family afterthought I'd believed myself to be. Was that coincidence, or was something shifting in the universe around me? The key Dot had left me seemed to pulse with possibility in my palm. Whatever lock it was meant to open, whatever secret she had hidden away, I knew it held the final piece of the puzzle she had been building for me all these years. The question was whether I was ready to discover what that puzzle revealed about who I really was, and who I had always been capable of becoming. Part 3. The Setup. The antique shop occupied a narrow building on Cedar Falls Main Street, squeezed between a used bookstore and a coffee shop that had seen better days. Thompson and Associates had been there for as long as I could remember, though I'd never had occasion to visit until now. The window display featured an eclectic mix of furniture and curiosities. A rocking chair with intricate carved arms, a collection of vintage perfume bottles, and what appeared to be a ship in a bottle that must have required incredible patience to create. I pushed open the door, setting off a brass bell that announced my arrival with a cheerful chime. The shop smelled of lemon oil and old wood, with undertones of something floral that might have been lavender. Every surface was carefully arranged with items that seemed to whisper stories of their former lives. A china tea set painted with tiny roses, a stack of leather-bound books with gilded edges, a jewelry box whose ballerina had long since stopped dancing. "Can I help you find something?" The voice came from somewhere deeper in the shop, followed by the sound of footsteps on creaky floorboards. Marcus Thompson emerged from behind a tall armoire, wiping his hands on a rag. He was younger than I'd expected, maybe mid-40s, with graying hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. His shirt sleeves were rolled up, revealing arms that spoke of years spent refinishing furniture and handling delicate antiques with care. "I'm Sarah Mitchell," I said, suddenly feeling uncertain about my plan. "My grandmother was Dorothy Mitchell, and I believe you purchased her desk at the estate sale yesterday." His expression softened immediately. "Ah, Mrs. Mitchell's granddaughter. I'm so sorry for your loss. Your grandmother was a remarkable woman. I had the pleasure of speaking with her several times over the years about various pieces she'd collected. This was news to me. She came here often." "Oh yes, quite regularly. She had an excellent eye for quality, and she understood the stories behind the objects she acquired. Not everyone does, you know. Many people see only the monetary value or the decorative appeal, but your grandmother understood that every antique carries the weight of human experience." I thought about Dot's house, filled with what my family had dismissed as clutter, and felt a familiar ache in my chest. "Mr. Thompson, this might sound strange, but I was wondering if I could take a look at her desk before you begin restoring it. There's something I need to check." He studied my face carefully, and I had the sense that he was weighing my request against some internal measure of trustworthiness. It's in the back workshop. Would you like me to show you? The workshop occupied the entire rear portion of the building, a space that managed to feel both organized and chaotic simultaneously. Half-finished projects covered most surfaces, from a dining room table with one leg in a clamp, to a mirror whose silver backing was being carefully restored. The smell of wood stain and varnish was stronger here, mixed with the sharp scent of metal polish and the earthy aroma of old paper. Dot's desk sat near the back wall, looking smaller and more fragile than I remembered from her house. It was a beautiful piece, even in its current state, Ate oak with intricate carved details around the drawers and legs that curved in graceful lines. But it also looked tired, bearing the scratches and water stains of decades of use. I plan to start working on it next week, Marcus said, running his hand along the scarred surface with obvious affection. The wood is solid, and those carvings are exquisite. Someone took real pride in crafting this piece. I approached the desk slowly, my heart beating faster as I tried to remember exactly where Dot had shown me the hidden compartment all those years ago. It had been on the left side, I thought, somewhere near the knee space. I knelt beside the desk and began running my fingers along the wood grain, searching for the subtle depression that would reveal the secret drawer. Lost something? Marcus asked. Maybe found something, I replied, continuing my exploration of the desk's hidden geography. My grandmother showed me a secret drawer when I was little. I'm hoping it's still. My finger found it, a small area where the wood gave slightly under pressure. I pressed down, and heard the faint click of a mechanism releasing. A narrow drawer, no bigger than a paperback book, slid out from what had appeared to be solid wood. Marcus whistled softly. Well, I'll be damned. I've been restoring furniture for 20 years, and I never would have found that without knowing where to look. The drawer was lined with faded blue velvet, and contained a small wooden box, the kind that might hold rings or other precious jewelry. My hands trembled as I lifted it out, feeling the weight of whatever Dot had considered important enough to hide away. The key from the cardboard box fit the lock perfectly. Inside the wooden box, wrapped in tissue paper that crackled with age, was a small silver locket. It was heart-shaped and clearly vintage, with an intricate pattern of vines and flowers engraved on the front. I opened the clasp carefully, half afraid of what I might find inside. The left side of the locket held a tiny photograph of a young woman I didn't recognize, someone with dark hair and serious eyes who might have been beautiful if she hadn't looked so sad. The right side contained an even smaller photograph, this one of a baby who couldn't have been more than a few months old. Do you recognize them? Marcus asked gently. I shook my head, studying the faces that were clearly important enough to Dot to merit this elaborate hiding place. I have no idea who they are. But even as I said it, something about the baby's face nagged at me. There was something familiar in the shape of the eyes, the curve of the mouth. I turned the locket over and found an inscription engraved on the back in script so small I had to squint to read it. For Sarah, with love eternal. Your mother, Margaret. The words hit me like a physical blow. Margaret, a name I had never heard in connection with my family, but somehow I knew with absolute certainty that this Margaret was connected to me in ways I didn't yet understand. Mr. Thompson, I said, my voice barely above a whisper, would it be possible for me to take this with me? I need to do some research, and I think this locket might help me understand something important about my grandmother. He nodded without hesitation. Of course. It was hidden in your grandmother's desk, which means she intended for someone to find it eventually. And given that the inscription mentions your name, I'd say you're exactly the person she had in mind. I wrapped the locket carefully in its tissue paper, and placed it back in the wooden box. My hands were shaking now, and my mind was racing with questions I wasn't sure I was ready to have answered. Who was Margaret? And why had she left me a locket I'd never received? What was the connection to Dot? And why had this secret been hidden away for what appeared to be decades? Your grandmother mentioned you quite often, Marcus said, as we walked back toward the front of the shop. She was very proud of you, you know. She said you were the only person in the family who truly understood her. She talked about me. The question came out more vulnerable than I'd intended. Oh, yes. She said you had what she called the gift of seeing. She believed you could look at something others might dismiss and understand its true value. She thought that was a rare quality, especially in someone so young. The gift of seeing. I thought about the cardboard box. At the estate sale, the way it had called to me while everyone else walked past. Maybe Dot had been right about that gift, even if I'd never recognized it in myself. The drive home passed in a blur of possibilities and fears. The locket sat in its box on the passenger seat beside me, feeling heavier than its size should have warranted. By the time I reached my apartment, the afternoon rain had started again, creating a rhythm on my windows that matched the anxious beating of my heart. I spread Dot's letters and journal on my coffee table alongside the wooden box, creating a timeline of evidence that suggested my life had been shaped by secrets I'd never known existed. The locket seemed to watch me from its nest of tissue paper, daring me to ask the questions that might change everything I thought I knew about my family and myself. Margaret, the name echoed in my mind, unfamiliar yet somehow significant. If she was my mother, as the inscription suggested, then who was the woman I'd called Mom for 32 years? And why had the truth been hidden away in a secret drawer, waiting for me to find it only after Dot was no longer here to explain? The baby in the photograph looked back at me with eyes that might have been my own, holding secrets that had been waiting decades to be revealed. Tomorrow, I would begin searching for answers. Tonight, I would sit with the weight of questions that threatened to rewrite everything I thought I knew about who I was and where I came from. Part 4. The catalyst moment. The Cedar Falls Library had always been my sanctuary, but today I approached it like a detective preparing to crack the most important case of my career. The locket sat heavy in my purse, its weight seeming to increase with every step I took toward the brick building that had housed my summer job during college. If answers existed about Margaret and the baby in the photograph, they would most likely be found in the genealogy section or the local newspaper archives that the library had been digitizing for the past several years. Mrs. Chen, the head librarian who had supervised my work all those summers ago, greeted me with the warm smile of someone who remembers when you were young and eager to please. "Sarah, how wonderful to see you. I heard about your grandmother. I'm so sorry for your loss." "Thank you, Mrs. Chen. I'm actually here doing some family research. I was hoping to use the genealogy computers and maybe look through some old newspaper records." She led me to the back corner of the library, where 3 computers were set up with access to ancestry databases and digitized local records. The space was quiet and private, surrounded by shelves of local history books and bound volumes of the Cedar Falls Gazette dating back to the town's founding. "Take your time, dear. Let me know if you need help with anything." I settled at the middle computer and pulled the locket from my purse, opening it carefully to study the photographs again in the better light of the library. The woman Margaret looked to be in her early 20s, with the kind of serious expression that suggested the photograph had been taken during a significant moment rather than a casual family portrait. The baby appeared healthy and alert, with eyes that seemed too wise for such a young face. I started with the most basic search: Margaret Mitchell, Cedar Falls, Ohio. The Ancestry database returned dozens of results, but none that seemed to match the time period I was looking for. I tried variations: Margaret Mitchell, born 1950s, Margaret Mitchell 1960s, Margaret Mitchell married name. Still nothing that felt right. Then I remembered something Dot had told me years ago about how women's stories often disappeared from public records when they married or moved away. Maybe Margaret hadn't been a Mitchell at all. Maybe she had become a Mitchell, briefly, before becoming someone else entirely. I switched tactics and began searching through the digitized newspaper archives, looking for birth announcements, marriage notices, obituaries, anything that might contain the name Margaret in connection with my family. The Cedar Falls Gazette had been a weekly publication for most of its history, which meant there were thousands of pages to search through, but the digitization had made them keyword searchable. 3 hours into my search, I found it. The birth announcement was small, tucked into a corner of the August 15, 1991 edition, easy to miss among the advertisements for back-to-school sales and notices about the upcoming county fair. Mitchell Margaret Rose Mitchell, a daughter, Sarah Elizabeth, on August 10, 1991, at Cedar Falls General Hospital. Baby and mother are doing well. I read the announcement 5 times before the words fully sank in. Sarah Elizabeth, my name, my birthday. Margaret Rose Mitchell, the woman in the locket. This was my birth announcement, but it listed Margaret as my mother, not Linda Mitchell, the woman who had raised me. My hands were shaking as I continued searching, looking for any other mention of Margaret Mitchell in the weeks and months following my birth. I found nothing until 6 months later, when a brief obituary appeared in the February 20, 1992 edition. Margaret Rose Mitchell, 22, passed away February 18 at Cedar Falls General Hospital after a brief illness. She is survived by her infant daughter, Sarah Elizabeth, and her mother-in-law, Dorothy Mitchell. Memorial services will be held privately. In lieu of flowers, donations may be made to the Cedar Falls Children's Fund. Brief illness. At 22, I calculated quickly, Margaret would have been barely past her 21st birthday when I was born, and she had lived only 6 months after that. The obituary was maddeningly vague, offering no details about who Margaret had been, how she had died, or what had happened to her infant daughter after her death. But there was one detail that sent a chill through me. She was survived by her mother-in-law, Dorothy Mitchell. Dot had been Margaret's mother-in-law, which meant Margaret had been married to Dot's son, but Dot had only had one son, my father, Robert Mitchell. The implications crashed over me like a wave. If Margaret had been married to my father and had given birth to me in 1991, that meant Linda Mitchell was not my biological mother. It meant I had been raised by my father's second wife, who had taken on the role of mother to a baby whose real mother had died when I was 6 months old. It explained so much why I had always felt slightly out of step with my family, why Jessica seemed to fit so naturally into a space I had never quite found for myself, why my parents' attention had always flowed more easily toward their real daughter, not because they didn't love me, but because I was a constant reminder of a tragedy they had chosen to bury rather than explain. I printed the obituary and birth announcement with hands that wouldn't stop trembling, then sat back in the library chair trying to process the magnitude of what I had discovered. Everything I had understood about my identity, about my place in the Mitchell family, had been built on a foundation that was literally not what it seemed. The locket made sense now. Margaret had left it for me, probably asking Dot to give it to me when I was old enough to understand. But instead of explaining the truth, my family had chosen to erase Margaret entirely, to let me grow up believing Linda was my biological mother, never knowing that my real mother had died when I was barely old enough to remember her face. Dot had kept the secret, but she had also kept the proof. The locket hidden away in her desk, the letters documenting my achievements that she made sure to collect, because she knew Margaret would have wanted them preserved, the journal entries recording every moment of my life, because she was maintaining the connection between mother and daughter that death had severed, but love had refused to abandon. I understood now why Dot had been the only person in my family who truly saw me. She had known Margaret, had loved her as a daughter-in-law, and she saw Margaret's ghost in my face every Sunday when I came to visit. While Linda was focused on the daughter she had given birth to, Dot was nurturing the daughter she had promised a dying woman she would protect and remember. The weight of grief and revelation was almost too much to bear. I had spent 32 years feeling like I didn't quite belong in my own family, and now I knew why. I also knew that somewhere in my earliest memories, buried beneath layers of time and assumed truth, were 6 months of being loved by a mother whose name I hadn't even known until today. Margaret Rose Mitchell, 22 years old when she died, barely more than a girl herself. She had left me a locket with her photograph and my baby picture, a tangible piece of love to carry forward, even though she couldn't be there to give it to me in person. Dot had honored that wish by hiding it away until I was ready to find it myself. As I gathered my printouts and prepared to leave the library, I realized that my search for answers had only led to more questions. How had Margaret died? What had she been like as a person? Did I have any of her mannerisms, her interests, her talents? And perhaps most importantly, what did this revelation mean for my relationship with Linda and Robert, the parents who had chosen to hide this fundamental truth about my origin? The drive home was a blur of emotions I couldn't name: grief for a mother I had never known I'd lost, anger at a family secret that had shaped my entire life without my knowledge, and something that might have been relief: the understanding that my sense of not quite fitting had been based on truth, rather than some failing on my part. The locket sat open on my passenger seat, Margaret's serious eyes watching over me as I navigated the familiar streets of the town where I had been born to her and raised by someone else. For the first time in my life, I was seeing Cedar Falls through the eyes of someone who belonged here in ways I was only beginning to understand. Part 5. Atmospheric grounding. The apartment felt different when I returned from the library, as if the revelation about Margaret had shifted the very air inside my small space. Objects that had seemed perfectly normal that morning now looked like stage props in a play I hadn't realized I was performing. The photograph of my family, the one from Jessica's college graduation, where we're all smiling at the camera, now seemed like evidence of an elaborate fiction. The woman I had called Mom for 32 years smiled back at me from the frame, and I found myself studying her face for signs of deception, for hints that she had been keeping this enormous secret all my adult life. I placed the locket on my coffee table next to Dot's letters and journal, creating a small shrine to truths I was only beginning to understand. The late afternoon light filtered through my single window, casting long shadows across the collection of evidence that was rewriting my entire understanding of myself. Margaret's photograph seemed to absorb the golden light, her serious eyes holding secrets I desperately wanted to unlock. The silence in my apartment felt heavy with the weight of questions that demanded answers. I made tea, not coffee this time, but the chamomile blend Dot had always served during our Sunday visits, and settled cross-legged on my futon to study the documents I'd brought home from the library. The birth announcement and obituary were just facts on paper, but they represented a seismic shift in everything I had believed about my origin story. Margaret Rose Mitchell. I said the name aloud, testing how it felt in my mouth. It was a pretty name, old-fashioned in a way that suggested someone who might have appreciated vintage clothes and classic literature, the kind of person who would choose a heart-shaped silver locket as a way to send love forward through time to a daughter she wouldn't live to raise. I opened Dot's journal again, this time looking for any mention of Margaret, any hint that my grandmother had been documenting not just my life, but my connection to the mother I'd never known I'd lost. The entries I'd read before took on new meaning now. When Dot wrote about my old soul, had she been seeing Margaret in me? When she mentioned that I understood beautiful things don't always come in perfect packages, was she thinking about a daughter-in-law who had died too young, leaving behind only fragments and memory? 3 pages into my rereading, I found what I was looking for. Sarah has Margaret's hands, read an entry from 5 years ago. Long fingers, always gentle with fragile things. Today she helped me repot the African violets, and I watched those hands work with the same careful attention Margaret used to give to her sketches. Sarah doesn't know about the sketches, doesn't know about so many things, but she carries pieces of her mother forward, whether she realizes it or not. Sketches. Margaret had been an artist. I felt a jolt of recognition. I had always loved drawing, though I'd never pursued it seriously. In school, I had been the one other students came to when they needed help with art projects. My apartment walls were covered with small watercolors and pencil drawings I'd done over the years, never thinking they were good enough to show anyone but satisfying some need I couldn't name. I flipped through more pages, finding scattered references that painted a picture of Margaret I had never been allowed to see. Sarah chose the same wildflowers Margaret used to bring me, Queen Anne's lace and chicory. She said they looked like they belonged in a fairy tale. And later, Sarah reads poetry with the same rhythm Margaret had, something in the cadence, the way she lets the words breathe, like mother, like daughter, even across the years. Each entry was a small piece of a puzzle. Dot had been assembling in secret, documenting the ways Margaret lived on in her daughter, despite being absent from the story everyone else was telling. I realized that Dot's house had been more than a refuge for me. It had been a place where I was unknowingly connected to my mother's memory, where someone was paying attention to the inheritance I carried without knowing its source. The rain that had been threatening all afternoon finally began, creating a steady rhythm against my window that matched the pace of my turning pages. I found myself sinking deeper into Dot's careful observations, seeing my own life reflected back through the lens of someone who understood what I was missing even when I didn't. Sarah stayed late today to help me organize the photographs, read an entry from 2 Christmases ago. She has such patience with old memories, such respect for the stories they tell. I showed her some pictures from before she was born, and she studied each one like she was trying to memorize the faces. I wanted to tell her about Margaret then, wanted to point to the picture of her mother laughing in my garden, but Robert and Linda have made their choice about what Sarah should know. It's not my place to unmake it, even though it breaks my heart to watch her search for something she doesn't know she's lost. The weight of what Dot had carried hit me like a physical blow. She had been the keeper of Margaret's memory, the guardian of a love story that had been cut short by tragedy, the witness to all the ways I resembled a mother I'd never known I had. And she had done it all in silence, respecting my parents' decision to build our family on a foundation of protective lies, while quietly documenting the truth for the day when I might be ready to hear it. I closed the journal and picked up the locket again, opening it to study Margaret's face more carefully. Now that I knew she had been an artist, I could see it in her expression, the way she looked at the camera, like she was seeing something beyond the lens, recording details that others might miss. Her eyes held the kind of intensity I recognized from my own reflection, the look I got when I was completely absorbed in a drawing, or lost in a good book. The baby picture on the other side of the locket showed a child who looked alert and curious, already reaching toward something beyond the frame. I tried to imagine what those 6 months with Margaret had been like, whether I had inherited more than just her hands and her eye for detail. Had she sung to me? Had she drawn pictures to hang above my crib? Had she made plans for the life we would build together before illness took her away? The brief obituary had mentioned a brief illness, but provided no details about what had claimed her life at 22. I made a mental note to return to the library tomorrow, to search for any other records that might illuminate how Margaret had died, and what my earliest months had been like before Linda stepped in to become the only mother I would remember. But tonight, I needed to process the emotional earthquake that had shaken loose everything I thought I knew about my family. I was 32 years old, and I was meeting my mother for the first time through a locket and a collection of journal entries written by someone who had loved us both. The woman who had raised me wasn't my biological mother, which meant Jessica wasn't my full sister, which meant my entire understanding of my place in the Mitchell family hierarchy had been built on incomplete information. It explained the subtle sense of otherness I had always felt, the way I never quite seemed to fit the mold that came so naturally to Jessica. We weren't just different personalities, we were daughters of different mothers, shaped by different genetic inheritances and different early experiences. Linda had raised me with love and care, but I had also been a daily reminder of her husband's first marriage, of the woman who had come before her and left behind a child who needed mothering. The complexity of what Linda had taken on began to dawn on me. She had married a widowed father and agreed to raise his infant daughter as her own, never letting on that I wasn't her biological child. Even as she went on to have Jessica 2 years later, she had given me her name and her daily care, had attended school conferences and birthday parties, had worried about my future and celebrated my achievements. But she had also chosen to erase Margaret from the story entirely, to let me grow up believing I was her biological daughter, when the truth was both more complicated and, in some ways, more beautiful. The rain continued its steady rhythm as evening settled around my small apartment. I made myself a simple dinner and ate it while studying the evidence spread across my coffee table. The letters from teachers, the journal entries from Dot, the locket from Margaret, and the newspaper clippings that had finally revealed the truth. Each piece represented a different person's attempt to love me well, to preserve something important about who I was and where I had come from. Tomorrow, I would have to decide what to do with this knowledge. Did I confront Linda and Robert about the deception? Did I share the discovery with Jessica, my half-sister, who had no idea our family dynamic had been shaped by a secret this enormous? Did I begin searching for more information about Margaret, trying to reconstruct the life and personality of the woman who had given birth to me, but hadn't lived to shape who I became? Tonight, I would sit with the strange comfort of finally understanding why I had always felt slightly out of place in my own life. The searching look in Margaret's eyes, the gentle hands Dot had recognized, the artistic tendencies I'd never fully explored. These were gifts from a mother I had never known I'd lost, and the locket she had left behind was proof that even in death, even across 32 years of silence, a mother's love could find a way to reach her daughter. I fell asleep that night, holding the locket, Margaret's photograph, the last thing I saw before my eyes closed. For the first time in my life, I went to sleep knowing what my mother looked like, even if I still had no memory what her voice had sounded like saying my name. Part 6. Origin Story. The morning after my discovery brought a clarity I hadn't expected, as if learning the truth about Margaret had adjusted the lens through which I saw everything else. I woke with the locket still clutched in my palm, its silver surface warmed by my skin, and for the first time in months I felt a sense of purpose that had nothing to do with job applications or family expectations. I had a mystery to solve, a mother to meet through whatever traces she had left behind, and a lifetime of questions that finally had somewhere to begin looking for answers. I returned to the library, with a notebook this time, determined to be methodical in my research. Mrs. Chen greeted me like an old friend returning to familiar territory, and I settled back at the genealogy computer, with the focused energy of someone who had found her mission. If Margaret Rose Mitchell had lived 22 years in Cedar Falls, if she had been married to my father, and had given birth to me here, then there had to be more traces of her existence than just a birth announcement and obituary. I started with the high school yearbooks, reasoning that if Margaret had grown up in Cedar Falls, she would have graduated from Cedar Falls High sometime in the late 1980s. The digitized yearbooks were stored on a separate database, and I worked my way backwards from 1989, scanning through senior class photos, looking for a face that matched the serious young woman in the locket. I found her in the 1988 yearbook, Margaret Rose Hartley, not Mitchell. The photograph was clearly the same person, though younger, and with the kind of bright smile that suggested she had been happy then, before whatever circumstances had led to that more somber expression in the locket. The entry beneath her photo listed her activities: art club, drama society, volunteer tutor. Under future plans, it simply said art school. Margaret Rose Hartley had wanted to be an artist. The confirmation of what Dot had hinted at in her journal entries sent a thrill of recognition through me. I traced my finger along the yearbook photo, studying the face that had given me half my genetic inheritance, looking for clues about who she had been beyond the facts of her birth and death. The yearbook provided more than just her photo. I found her mentioned several times throughout the pages, accepting an award for a painting at the annual art show, playing a supporting role in the spring drama production of Our Town, tutoring elementary students, in reading as part of a community service project. The picture that emerged was of someone who had been quietly talented, involved, but not necessarily popular, someone who had preferred creating and helping others to seeking the spotlight for herself. In the drama club photo, Margaret stood in the back row, but her face was turned slightly toward another student, a tall boy with dark hair, whose arm was casually draped around her shoulders. I studied his face, wondering if this might be my father in high school, but the boy looked nothing like Robert Mitchell. This was someone else, someone who had been important enough to Margaret that the camera had captured them in a moment of obvious affection. I found him identified in the caption, "Drama Society members prepare for spring production." Back row, James Peterson, Margaret Hartley, Susan Chen, David Walsh. James Peterson. I wrote the name in my notebook, wondering what role he had played in Margaret's story, and whether he might still be living in Cedar Falls. The more I discovered about Margaret's high school years, the more questions arose about how she had ended up married to my father. Robert Mitchell was 10 years older than Margaret, which would have made him 28 when she was 18. He had already been working at his accounting firm for several years when she graduated from high school. How had they met? What had drawn them together? And what had happened to James Peterson, the boy who had been important enough to stand close to in the drama club photo? I switched to searching marriage records and found what I was looking for in the Cedar Falls County archives. Margaret Rose Hartley had married Robert James Mitchell on June 15, 1990. She would have been 21 years old. He would have been 31. I was born 14 months later, which meant Margaret had been married for barely a year when she became pregnant with me. The marriage record listed witnesses: Dorothy Mitchell, Robert's mother, and Eleanor Hayes, who I assumed must have been Margaret's friend. The address listed for Margaret before the marriage was 412 Pine Street, and I made a note to drive by later to see if the house might offer any additional clues about her life before she became a Mitchell. But first, I wanted to search for Eleanor Hayes. If she had been important enough to Margaret to serve as a witness at her wedding, she might have memories and stories that could help me understand who my mother had been as a person, rather than just a collection of dates and documents. Eleanor Hayes proved easier to find than I had expected. She was listed in the current Cedar Falls phone directory, with an address on Elm Street that was only a few miles from my apartment. According to the online white pages, she was now Eleanor Hayes Sullivan, which suggested she had married sometime after serving as Margaret's wedding witness. I stared at the address for a long time, my pen hovering over the notebook page. Finding Eleanor was one thing, actually contacting her was something entirely different. What would I say? How do you call someone you've never met and ask them to tell you about a friend who died 32 years ago? How do you explain that you're the daughter who never knew her mother existed until yesterday? But as I sat in the quiet library, surrounded by the tools of historical research, I realized that these conversations were exactly what I needed to have. Margaret hadn't been just a name in a newspaper, or a face in a locket. She had been a real person with friends and dreams, and a life that had been cut short just as it was beginning. If I wanted to understand who she had been, if I wanted to claim the inheritance she had left for me, I needed to talk to the people who had known her when she was alive. I wrote Eleanor's contact information in my notebook, and continued searching, looking for any other traces of Margaret's existence in the public record. I found her mentioned in a few more newspaper articles, accepting a scholarship to attend Columbus College of Art and Design in 1988, participating in a local art show in 1989, where her painting of the Cedar Falls covered bridge had won second place. Each discovery added another small piece to the portrait of someone who had been talented and ambitious, someone who had plans for her life that extended far beyond the small town where she'd grown up. The scholarship article mentioned that Margaret had been the first member of her family to attend college, and that she planned to major in fine arts with a focus on illustration. I tried to imagine her in art school, surrounded by other creative young people, learning techniques and developing her vision. Had she intended to become a professional artist? Had she met my father during a break from college, or had she given up her education to marry him? The timeline suggested she had left college early. The scholarship article was from spring 1988, which meant she should have graduated in 1992, but she had married my father in 1990 and died in 1992, which left a gap where her college years should have been. Had she dropped out to get married? Had financial pressures forced her to leave school, or had something else entirely changed the trajectory of her life? I found a partial answer in an unexpected place. The Cedar Falls Gazette had run a feature story in December 1989 about young people who had returned to town after college, contributing to the local community while building their careers. Margaret was mentioned as someone who had come back from art school to care for an ailing parent, and who was now working part-time at the Cedar Falls Art Center, while exploring opportunities to combine her artistic training with community service. Caring for an ailing parent, that explained why she had left college early, why she had been back in Cedar Falls, where she could meet my father, but it also raised more questions about her family situation. The obituary had mentioned that she was survived by her mother-in-law, but hadn't listed any of her own relatives. Had her parents died before her? Did I have grandparents on Margaret's side that I'd never known about? The research was becoming overwhelming. each answer leading to 3 new questions, each document revealing another layer of complexity to the story I was trying to piece together. I realized I was approaching this backwards, trying to construct Margaret's entire life history, when what I really needed was to understand the specific circumstances that had brought her into my father's life and led to my existence. I closed the yearbooks and genealogy databases and instead pulled up the Cedar Falls Gazette archives again, this time searching for any mention of Robert Mitchell during the relevant time period. If Margaret had been working at the Art Center in 1989 and had married my father in 1990, there might be some record of how they had met or what their courtship had been like. I found what I was looking for in the society pages from February 1990, 4 months before their wedding. There was a small announcement about a fundraising event for the Cedar Falls Community Hospital, with a photograph showing several couples at what appeared to be a formal dinner dance. The caption identified Robert Mitchell, local businessman, with Margaret Hartley, Cedar Falls Art Center coordinator. The photograph was small and not particularly clear, but I could make out my father looking much as I remembered him from my childhood, conservative and serious in a dark suit. Margaret stood beside him, in a dress that looked elegant even in the grainy newspaper reproduction, her hair styled in a way that suggested this was a special occasion. They weren't touching in the photo, but they stood close enough to suggest familiarity, comfort with each other's presence. What struck me most about the photograph was how young Margaret looked, even younger than her 21 years. Standing next to my father, who had always seemed solid and established and thoroughly adult to me, she looked almost like a college student playing dress-up. It made me wonder about the dynamics of their relationship, whether she had been looking for stability and security after leaving college to care for her parent, whether he had been attracted to her youth and artistic spirit. The fundraiser had been for the hospital's new pediatric wing, which meant Margaret had been involved in community service even while working at the art center. I wondered if this had been how they'd met, through some volunteer activity or community board where my father's accounting skills and Margaret's artistic abilities had brought them into the same circle. I printed the photograph and the article, adding them to my growing collection of evidence about Margaret's life. The picture was frustrating in its lack of detail, but it was also precious, one of the few images I'd found of my parents together, proof that they had existed as a couple, that there had been a time when they had attended social events and been photographed as partners. By the time I left the library that afternoon, I had filled an entire notebook with names, dates, addresses, and questions. Margaret was beginning to take shape as more than just a tragic figure in an obituary. She had been someone with talents and ambitions, someone who had cared about her community and had friends who loved her enough to stand up at her wedding. She had also been someone who had made choices I didn't entirely understand, who had left college to care for family and then married a man 10 years older, who could offer her security but perhaps not the artistic life she had once planned. The drive to 412 Pine Street took me through the older section of Cedar Falls, where the houses were smaller and closer together, where the trees were mature enough to arch over the narrow streets and create tunnels of green shade. Margaret's childhood home turned out to be a modest 2-story house, with a small front porch and a yard that showed signs of careful tending. The current owners had painted it yellow with white trim, and it looked welcoming in a way that suggested it had been a happy place to grow up. I parked across the street and studied the house, trying to imagine Margaret as a child playing in that yard, as a teenager looking out those second-story windows and dreaming about art school and the wider world beyond Cedar Falls. The house seemed too small to contain all the questions I had about her early life, too ordinary to explain how someone with artistic ambitions had ended up married to my father and dead before her 23rd birthday. But it was real, solid, a physical location where Margaret had existed and grown up and made the decisions that had ultimately led to my existence. I sat in my car for a long time, watching the house and the street and the ordinary neighborhood where my mother had spent her first 18 years, until the late afternoon light began to fade, and it was time to drive home and decide whether I was ready to start making phone calls to strangers who had known her when she was alive. Part 7. Present reality check. The conversation with Eleanor Hayes Sullivan was both easier and more difficult than I had imagined. When I finally worked up the courage to call her that evening, she answered on the second ring with the kind of warm voice that suggested she was someone who genuinely enjoyed talking with people. Mrs. Hayes Sullivan. My name is Sarah Mitchell. I believe you knew my mother Margaret Hartley back in the 1990s. There was a long pause, and when she spoke again, her voice was softer, more careful. Margaret. Oh my goodness, I haven't heard that name in years. You said you're her daughter? Yes. I know this must seem strange, calling out of nowhere like this. I've recently learned some things about my mother that I didn't know before, and I was hoping you might be willing to share some memories of her with me. Another pause, longer this time. Sarah, honey, would you mind if I asked how much you know about your mother's situation? I mean, about what happened. The question confirmed what I had already suspected. There were layers to Margaret's story that went beyond what I'd found in newspaper archives and yearbook photos. I know she died when I was 6 months old. I know she was married to my father and that she'd been an art student before coming back to Cedar Falls. But honestly, until this week, I didn't even know she existed. I was raised believing someone else was my biological mother. Oh, sweetheart. Eleanor's voice was full of sympathy and something that might have been anger. I always wondered what happened to you, whether anyone was telling you about her. Would you like to come over for coffee? I think this conversation would be better in person. Eleanor lived in a craftsman-style bungalow with a garden that rivaled Dot's for careful attention and creative arrangement. She met me at the door with the kind of embrace usually reserved for family members, as if seeing me was a gift she hadn't expected to receive. You look just like her, she said, holding me at arm's length to study my face. Same eyes, same bone structure. Margaret was beautiful, but she never quite believed it herself. Her living room was comfortable in the way that comes from years of being genuinely lived in rather than just decorated. Bookshelves lined 2 walls, filled with volumes that showed signs of being read rather than just displayed. The coffee she served was excellent, accompanied by homemade cookies that reminded me of the kind Dot used to make. Margaret and I met freshman year of high school. Eleanor began without waiting for me to ask specific questions. She was this quiet, serious girl who always had a sketchbook with her, always drawing something. Most of the other kids thought she was a little odd, but I could see she was just seeing things the rest of us missed. She got up and disappeared into another room, returning with a photo album that she set on the coffee table between us. I kept these all these years, thinking maybe someday someone would want to see them. The first photograph showed 2 teenage girls sitting on what appeared to be Eleanor's front porch, both grinning at the camera. Margaret looked younger and happier than in any of the other images I'd seen, her hair longer and less carefully styled, her expression open and unguarded. That was junior year, I think. We'd just gotten our driver's licenses and felt like we owned the world. Eleanor turned the page, revealing more casual photographs. Margaret at what appeared to be a school picnic. Margaret and Eleanor dressed up for homecoming. Margaret sitting in what looked like an art classroom, completely absorbed in a painting she was working on. Tell me about her family, I said. I couldn't find much information about her parents or siblings. Eleanor's expression grew more serious. Margaret's situation at home was complicated. Her father left when she was 12, just up and disappeared one day. Her mother Carol tried her best, but she had problems with alcohol and depression. Margaret basically raised herself from middle school on, and she was determined to get out of Cedar Falls and make something of her life. This explained why Margaret had been the first in her family to attend college, why receiving the art school scholarship had been so significant. It also explained why she had come back to care for an ailing parent. She had been responsible for her mother for most of her teenage years. What happened when she came back from college? Eleanor sighed, her fingers tracing the edge of one of the photographs. Carol had been diagnosed with early-onset Alzheimer's. She was only 52, but the disease was progressing quickly. Margaret came back to take care of her, planning to finish school later once she got her mother settled in a care facility. But Carol died 6 months after Margaret came home, and Margaret was just lost for a while. I tried to imagine what that must have been like. Giving up art school and your dreams to care for someone who was already forgetting who you were, then finding yourself alone at 21 with no clear path forward. Is that when she met my father? Robert was on the hospital board where Carol had been receiving care. Margaret was trying to handle all the arrangements, the insurance, the paperwork, and she was completely overwhelmed. Robert helped her navigate the bureaucracy, and I think his stability appealed to her after everything she'd been through. Eleanor turned another page in the photo album, revealing a picture I hadn't expected to see. It showed Margaret in a wedding dress, but not the formal portrait I might have anticipated. Instead, it was clearly a candid shot taken during the reception, showing Margaret laughing at something off camera, her face radiant with happiness. She was beautiful that day, Eleanor said softly. I was her maid of honor, and I'd never seen her so happy. She felt like she'd finally found her place, like she could stop worrying about survival and start thinking about building a life. But there was something in Eleanor's voice that suggested the happiness hadn't lasted. What happened? I asked. Eleanor closed the album and sat back in her chair, studying my face as if deciding how much truth I could handle. Margaret loved your father, but I don't think she was prepared for how different their worlds were. Robert was established, conservative, very much a part of the Cedar Falls social fabric. Margaret was still figuring out who she wanted to be, and I think she sometimes felt like she was playing a role rather than living her own life. This resonated with something I had sensed in the newspaper photograph of them at the hospital fundraiser, the way Margaret had looked young and slightly overwhelmed, standing next to my father's confident composure. She tried to fit into his world. Eleanor continued. She joined the right committees, attended the right social functions, did all the things that were expected of a businessman's wife. But she was also trying to figure out how to continue with her art, how to be creative within the constraints of the life she'd chosen. Did she keep painting after she got married? Eleanor's smile was sad. She tried. She set up a small studio in the spare bedroom of their house. Your house, I suppose. But Robert didn't really understand art, didn't see it as important or practical. He wasn't unsupportive exactly, but he didn't encourage it either. And Margaret was so used to putting other people's needs first, that she started treating her art like a hobby rather than a calling. I thought about the artistic tendencies I'd never fully explored, the drawings I'd made over the years, but never taken seriously. Had I inherited Margaret's talent along with her tendency to minimize her own creative impulses? Tell me about when I was born. Eleanor's expression brightened. Oh, she was so excited about you. She'd been married for over a year, and was starting to feel like she'd found her rhythm as Robert's wife, and then she got pregnant and it was like someone had lit a light inside her. She spent hours planning your nursery, sketching ideas for the walls, collecting children's books. She got up again and returned with a small wooden box, similar to the one I'd found in Dot's desk. She made this for you, Eleanor said, opening the lid to reveal a collection of small drawings on heavy paper. She planned to frame them for your room, but she never got the chance. The drawings were exquisite fairy tale illustrations done in delicate watercolors, showing princesses and gardens and magical creatures. They were clearly the work of someone with professional training and natural talent, far more sophisticated than anything I'd ever attempted. Each illustration was signed with a small heart, and the letters MRM. She was so proud to be your mother, Eleanor said, watching my face as I studied the illustrations. She said you were going to grow up surrounded by beautiful things, that she was finally going to have someone who would appreciate art the way she did. The weight of what I had missed, what Margaret had planned for us to share, was almost unbearable. I could see the nursery she had envisioned, walls covered with her illustrations, a mother and daughter bonding over creativity and imagination. What happened to her? I asked. The obituary just said brief illness. Eleanor was quiet for a long time, and I could see her wrestling with how much to tell me. Margaret developed postpartum depression after you were born. Back then, people didn't understand it the way they do now, didn't recognize it as a medical condition that needed treatment. Everyone just expected her to be happy because she had a beautiful baby. I felt a chill of recognition. Postpartum depression was treatable now, but in 1992 it would have been poorly understood, especially in a small town like Cedar Falls. She tried to get help. Eleanor continued. She told me she felt like she was disappearing, like she couldn't connect with you the way she wanted to. Robert thought she just needed to try harder, needed to focus on being grateful for what she had. The doctor prescribed medication, but it made her feel even more disconnected from herself. Is that what killed her? Eleanor nodded, her eyes bright with unshed tears. She took too many pills one night when you were 6 months old. The official ruling was accidental overdose, but those of us who knew her well understood it was more complicated than that. She wasn't trying to die, she was trying to make the pain stop. The room was quiet except for the ticking of an old clock on Eleanor's mantel. I sat holding Margaret's illustrations, trying to process the reality that my mother had died by suicide, that the depression following my birth had been too overwhelming for her to survive. I should have done more, Eleanor said quietly. I should have insisted she get better help, should have recognized how desperate she was becoming. But she was so good at hiding it, so determined to be the perfect wife and mother that everyone expected her to be. Does my father know about what really happened? Eleanor's expression hardened slightly. Robert knew, but he chose to let people believe it was just a tragic accident, and I think over time he convinced himself that was the truth. It was easier than admitting his wife had been struggling and he hadn't known how to help her. The pieces were falling into place now. Why my father had been so quick to remarry, why the family had chosen to erase Margaret entirely rather than preserve her memory. Her death hadn't just been tragic, it had been complicated and stigmatized and impossible to explain in the social circles where Robert Mitchell had built his reputation. What happened to me during all of this? Robert's mother Dorothy took care of you for the first few months after Margaret died. Then Robert met Linda, and she was willing to take on a ready-made family. I think everyone thought it would be easier if they just started fresh. Let Linda be your mother from the beginning instead of trying to explain the complicated truth. I thought about Linda, who had raised me with love and patience, who had attended school conferences and helped with homework and worried about my future. She had taken on the enormous responsibility of raising another woman's child, had given me stability and care in the aftermath of a tragedy I hadn't even known had occurred. But she had also been part of the decision to erase Margaret entirely, to let me grow up believing I was her biological daughter, never knowing that my real mother had died of despair just 6 months after giving me life. I kept hoping someone would tell you the truth eventually. Eleanor said. I thought when you got older, when you started asking questions about family history, someone would explain about Margaret. But the years kept passing, and it seemed like the secret was getting bigger instead of smaller. She handed me the box of illustrations. These belong to you. They always have. Margaret made them because she wanted her daughter to grow up surrounded by beauty, and even though she's not here to share them with you herself, her love for you is still real. I held the box carefully, feeling the weight of Margaret's dreams for the daughter she hadn't lived to raise. The fairy tale illustrations were more than just pretty pictures. They were evidence of a mother's love, proof that Margaret had imagined our future together, and had tried to create something lasting and beautiful to welcome me into the world. The drive home took me through the center of Cedar Falls, past the high school where Margaret had been a quiet art student, past the hospital where she had died, past the streets where she had walked and dreamed and struggled and loved. For the first time, I was seeing my hometown through the eyes of someone who belonged there in ways I was only beginning to understand. I had come looking for information about my mother, and had found something more complex than I had expected. Not just a tragic figure who had died young, but a real person who had faced difficult choices and overwhelming challenges, who had loved me deeply, but had been unable to survive the aftermath of bringing me into the world. Margaret Rose Mitchell had been an artist who had given up her dreams to care for family. A young woman who had married for stability but had never stopped longing for creative expression. A mother who had wanted to give her daughter beautiful things but had been overwhelmed by the darkness of postpartum depression. She had left me a locket, a collection of illustrations, and a complex legacy of love and loss that I was only beginning to process. The truth was more painful than the simple story I had constructed from newspaper articles and yearbook photos, but it was also more real. Margaret hadn't been a perfect mother taken too soon. She had been a human being with struggles and dreams and limitations, someone who had loved me as much as she was able but hadn't been equipped to survive the challenges that followed my birth. Understanding that didn't make the loss less tragic, but it made Margaret more real to me. She wasn't just a name in an obituary anymore. She was my mother, complicated and creative and flawed and real. Someone whose love for me had been genuine even if it hadn't been enough to keep her alive. Part 8. Internal Journey. The nights following my conversation with Eleanor were filled with dreams that felt more like memories trying to surface. I would wake with fragments of sensation. The feeling of being held, the sound of someone humming a melody I couldn't quite place, the impression of gentle hands and a voice speaking words I couldn't understand, but that felt familiar nonetheless. Whether these were actual memories from my first 6 months with Margaret or just my mind trying to fill in the blanks, I couldn't tell, but they left me with a sense of having been loved in ways I was only now beginning to remember. I had arranged Margaret's fairy tale illustrations around my apartment, propping them against bookshelves, and taping them to walls, surrounding myself with the nursery decorations she had planned, but never been able to hang. The effect was transformative. My small practical space suddenly felt magical, filled with princesses in flowing gowns and gardens, where impossible flowers bloomed in jewel-bright colors. For the first time since losing my teaching job, I felt inspired to create something myself. I bought a sketchbook and a set of colored pencils, telling myself I was just curious about whether I had inherited any of Margaret's artistic ability. But as I began to draw, copying her style at first, and then developing my own variations, I discovered that creating art felt like coming home to a part of myself I had never known existed. My hands seemed to remember techniques I had never learned, and colors appeared on the paper that felt right in ways I couldn't explain. The more I drew, the more I understood what Dot had meant in her journal entries about my having Margaret's hands. It wasn't just that we shared similar bone structure, it was that we shared an instinct for how to hold a brush, how to layer colors, how to create depth and light on a flat surface. Art wasn't just something Margaret had done, it was something she had been, and it was something that lived in me too. But discovering this connection to Margaret also brought a new kind of grief. I wasn't just mourning the mother I had never known. I was mourning the artistic partnership we might have shared, the conversations about color and composition that would never happen, the years of creating together that had been lost when she died. She had planned to raise me surrounded by beauty, to nurture the creative instincts she had recognized in herself, and instead I had grown up believing I was practical and ordinary, never knowing that art was part of my inheritance. The unfairness of it consumed me some days. Margaret had died believing she was failing as a mother, overwhelmed by depression, and unable to connect with me the way she wanted to. But the illustrations she had left behind showed no signs of that disconnection. They were filled with joy and whimsy and love, evidence of a mother who had been dreaming of sharing magic with her daughter. If she had lived, if she had received proper treatment for her depression, how different might both our lives have been. I found myself angry at my father and Linda in ways that surprised me with their intensity. They had made decisions about my life based on their own comfort rather than what might have been best for me. They had erased Margaret not just from the family narrative but from my sense of self, depriving me of a connection to my creative heritage that might have shaped my entire life differently. I had spent 32 years feeling like I didn't quite fit in the Mitchell family, and now I knew why. I was only half Mitchell, and the other half had been systematically deleted from my story. But my anger was complicated by grief for what Linda had taken on. She had married a widowed father, and agreed to raise his infant daughter as her own, never knowing that someday I might discover the truth and question her choices. She had loved me and cared for me, and worried about my future, and she had done it while carrying the weight of a secret that grew heavier every year. When Jessica was born 2 years after Margaret died, Linda had become the mother of two daughters, but only one of them had been fully hers from the beginning. The complexity of the situation made it impossible to know how to feel, or what to do next. I was grateful to Linda for the stability and love she had provided, but I was also angry about the deception. I was sad about Margaret's death, but I was also furious that her depression hadn't been properly treated. I was glad to finally understand why I had always felt different from Jessica, but I was also grieving for the sister relationship we might have had if we had grown up knowing we were half sisters rather than full sisters. The secret had shaped everything about my family dynamic, creating undercurrents and tensions that no one had been willing to name. Linda's slight preference for Jessica, which I had attributed to personality differences, now seemed more complex. Was it harder to love completely the child who was a daily reminder of your husband's first wife? My father's emotional distance from me, which I had interpreted as disappointment in my life choices, might have been his way of managing grief and guilt over Margaret's death. Even Jessica's easy assumption of her place as the successful daughter made more sense now. She had never had to compete with a ghost. The weight of carrying this knowledge alone was becoming unbearable. I needed to talk to someone, but I wasn't ready to confront my parents or disrupt Jessica's understanding of our family. The only person who might understand was gone. Dot had taken the secret to her grave, leaving me to navigate the emotional aftermath on my own. I called Eleanor several times that week, needing to hear stories about Margaret that went beyond the tragic circumstances of her death. Eleanor seemed to understand my hunger for details about who my mother had been as a living person, rather than just a figure in a cautionary tale. She had the most beautiful laugh, Eleanor told me during one conversation. Not loud or attention-seeking, but musical. When Margaret really found something funny, her whole face would light up and you couldn't help but smile too. She could find humor in the smallest things. A cat stuck in a ridiculous position, a sign with a funny typo, the way people looked when they were concentrating too hard. These glimpses of Margaret's personality were precious to me. I discovered that she had been left-handed like me, that she had preferred tea to coffee, that she had been afraid of spiders but loved thunderstorms. She had been a voracious reader, who could never pass a bookstore without going inside, and she had harbored a secret dream of illustrating children's books professionally. She would have been so proud of you becoming a teacher, Eleanor said. She always said she wanted to find ways to bring art into education, to show children that creativity was just as important as any other subject. When she volunteered as a reading tutor in high school, she used to sketch little illustrations in the margins of the books to help the kids stay engaged. This revelation hit me like a physical blow. Margaret had understood the connection between art and education, had dreamed of combining them in ways that could make learning more beautiful and engaging for children. I had become a teacher without knowing that my mother had shared that vision, had chosen a profession that honored her values without realizing the connection. All those years when my parents had seemed lukewarm about my career choice, when they had suggested I consider something more practical, I had been following a path that Margaret would have celebrated. The children I had taught, the creativity I had brought to my classroom, the way I had always found myself doodling illustrations on the whiteboard to help explain concepts, these were all expressions of an inheritance I hadn't known I carried. I began to see my entire life differently through the lens of understanding who Margaret had been. My tendency to notice details others missed, my love of fairy tales and fantasy, my instinctive connection with children who seemed lost or overlooked. These weren't random personality traits but echoes of my mother's way of seeing the world. Even my relationship with Dot made more sense now. Dot had seen Margaret and me from the beginning, and had been nurturing that connection through our Sunday visits, our conversations about beauty and stories, our shared appreciation for things others might dismiss as impractical or unimportant. She had been keeping Margaret's memory alive through me, honoring the daughter-in-law she had loved by loving the granddaughter Margaret had left behind. The realization that I had been living out aspects of Margaret's personality and dreams without knowing it was both comforting and unsettling.
How much of who I thought I was had been shaped by genetics and inherited tendencies rather than conscious choices? If I had known about Mark from the beginning, if I had grown up with her illustrations on my walls and stories about her dreams in my ears, would I have developed my artistic abilities sooner? Would I have been more confident in my creative instincts? But there was also something empowering about discovering that my
Deepest interests and talents weren't accidents, but inheritances. The part of me that had always felt different from the rest of the Mitchell family wasn't a flaw or failing minutes, it was Margaret's legacy, expressing itself. Part 9. The Hidden Truth. The phone call from Jessica came on a Thursday morning 3 weeks after I had discovered Margaret's locket. I was sitting at my small kitchen table working on a watercolor illustration, something I had never attempted before finding my mother's fairy tale drawings, when Jessica's name appeared on my phone screen. "Sarah, I need to talk to you about something," she said without preamble. Her voice carried a tension I rarely heard from my usually confident sister. "Can you meet me for coffee? It's important." We met at the little cafe on Main Street, where we had sometimes gone as teenagers when we wanted to feel grown up and sophisticated. Jessica arrived before me, already claiming a corner table with 2 steaming cups in front of her. She looked tired, her usual polished appearance slightly disheveled in a way that suggested she had been wrestling with something difficult. "I found something," she said as soon as I sat down. "In Mom's jewelry box. I was helping her reorganize her bedroom closet last weekend, and she asked me to sort through her jewelry, decide what she should keep and what she might want to pass on to us." Jessica reached into her purse and pulled out a small envelope, yellowed with age, my father's name written across it in handwriting I now recognized as Margaret's. This was tucked behind the lining of Mom's jewelry box, Jessica continued. "Hidden, like someone didn't want it to be found, but couldn't bring themselves to throw it away either." My hands trembled as I took the envelope. Inside was a letter written on pale blue stationery, dated 2 weeks before my birth. "My dearest Robert," it began. "I know these past months have been difficult for both of us as we prepare for Sarah's arrival. I've been struggling with feelings I don't completely understand, but I want you to know that none of it changes how much I love you or how grateful I am for the life we're building together." The letter went on for 3 pages, Margaret's careful handwriting documenting her fears about becoming a mother, her struggles with feeling disconnected from her pregnancy, her desperate hope that everything would feel different once I was born. It was heartbreaking in its honesty. A woman trying to articulate depression she didn't have words for, reaching out to a husband who might not understand what she was experiencing. "I've been having dreams where I can't find the baby," she had written, "where I'm searching through the house, calling for her but she's nowhere to be found. I wake up terrified that I won't be able to love her the way she deserves, that I'll fail her the way my own mother failed me. Please be patient with me as I figure out how to be the mother Sarah needs." The letter ended with a promise to try harder, to be worthy of the family they were creating together, to find ways to manage the darkness that seemed to be growing inside her. It was signed "All My Love, Margaret," with a small heart drawn beside her name. Jessica and I sat in silence for several minutes after I finished reading. Around us, the cafe continued, its normal rhythm of conversations and coffee orders, but our corner table felt suspended in its own bubble of revelation and grief. "She was your mother," Jessica said finally. "It wasn't a question. Yes, I found out a few weeks ago. I've been trying to figure out how to tell you, how to explain everything I've learned." Jessica's eyes filled with tears. "I always knew something was different about our family dynamic. The way Mom and Dad treated us wasn't quite the same, but I told myself I was imagining it. I convinced myself that you were just harder for them to understand because you were more artistic, more sensitive." She wiped her eyes with a napkin, smearing her mascara slightly. "But you weren't harder to understand. You were a reminder of something they wanted to forget." I told Jessica everything I had discovered through the locket in Dot's hidden drawer, The research at the library, the conversation with Eleanor, the fairy tale illustrations that were currently transforming my apartment into the nursery Margaret had planned but never been able to create. Jessica listened without interrupting, her expression cycling through shock, sadness, and something that looked like relief. "It makes sense now," she said when I finished, "why you always seem to have this sadness underneath everything, even when you were happy. Why Grandma Dot was so protective of you, so careful to document every little thing you did. Why Mom gets that look on her face sometimes when you laugh. It's not annoyance, it's pain." The realization that Jessica had been observing these family dynamics all along, trying to understand patterns that hadn't made sense, was both comforting and heartbreaking. She had grown up knowing she was the favored daughter, but not understanding why, carrying guilt about advantages she hadn't asked for or understood. "What do we do now?" she asked. "Do we confront them? Do we pretend we don't know?" Before I could answer, my phone buzzed with a text message from my mother. "Linda," I corrected myself, though the distinction still felt strange. "Family dinner Sunday, please come, we need to talk." Jessica saw me reading the message and looked puzzled until I showed her the screen. "That's weird timing," she said. "Do you think they know we've been digging into the past?" "I don't know, but I think maybe it's time for all the secrets to come out." The drive to my parents' house on Sunday felt longer than usual, weighted with the knowledge that everything was about to change. Jessica and I had agreed to arrive together, to face whatever conversation was waiting as a united front. She had spent the week processing the revelation about Margaret, and I could see her working through how this new information reframed her entire understanding of our family. The house looked the same as always, the carefully maintained lawn, the seasonal decorations on the front porch, the sense of suburban respectability that had always been important to my parents. But as we walked up the front steps, I was seeing it through different eyes. This was the house where Margaret had lived during her brief marriage to my father, where she had set up her art studio in the spare bedroom, where she had planned my nursery and dreamed of the future we would share. Linda met us at the door with an expression I had never seen before: nervous, almost fearful. She hugged us both, holding on a little longer than usual, and I could feel the tension in her shoulders. "Your father is in the living room," she said. "We have some things we need to discuss." The living room felt formal in a way it rarely did, as if we were gathering for a business meeting rather than a family dinner. My father sat in his usual chair, but his posture was rigid, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. Linda took her place on the sofa, leaving Jessica and me to claim the remaining chairs. "We know you've been asking questions," my father began without preamble. "Eleanor Hayes called us last week. She said you'd been to see her, that you'd learned about Margaret." The admission hung in the air between us, 3 decades of careful silence finally broken. I looked at Linda, whose face was pale but determined, as if she had been preparing for this conversation for years. "We should have told you the truth from the beginning," Linda said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But you were so young when Margaret died, and we thought it would be easier if you just grew up believing I was your biological mother. We thought it would hurt less." "Easier for who?" The question came out sharper than I had intended, but I didn't apologize. "Easier for you maybe, but I spent my entire life feeling like I didn't quite fit, like there was something wrong with me that I couldn't figure out." My father's composure cracked slightly. "Margaret was sick, Sarah, after you were born. She developed severe depression, and we didn't know how to help her. The doctors tried different medications, but nothing seemed to work. She was convinced she was a terrible mother, that she was going to damage you somehow. So you decided to erase her entirely. We decided to give you stability." Linda interjected, her voice stronger now. "Margaret was gone, and you needed a mother who could be present for you, who could love you without the complications of grief and guilt that Margaret's memory carried." I thought about the letter Jessica had found, Margaret's desperate plea for patience and understanding as she struggled with feelings she couldn't name or control. Did you ever consider that maybe I had a right to know about the woman who gave birth to me? That maybe understanding where I came from might have helped me understand myself? We were young, my father said. I was a 33-year-old widower with an infant daughter, trying to figure out how to move forward after losing the woman I loved. When I met Linda, when she was willing to take on the responsibility of raising you, it seemed like a miracle. We thought a fresh start would be better for everyone. Jessica had been quiet during this exchange, but now she spoke up. What about me? Was I born to replace Sarah's real mother, to give you the family dynamic you actually wanted? Linda's face crumpled. Oh honey, no. You were born because we wanted to expand our family, because we loved each other and wanted to have a child together. But I won't lie and say the situation wasn't complicated. Raising Sarah while carrying the secret of who she really was, watching her struggle to find her place in a family story that wasn't complete. It was harder than I expected. The admission was devastating in its honesty. Linda had loved me and cared for me, but she had also been carrying the burden of a deception that grew heavier every year. Every time I had felt like I didn't quite belong, she had known why but couldn't explain it. I found Margaret's fairy tale illustrations, I said, the ones she painted for my nursery. Did you know about them? My father nodded slowly. She had been working on them before she died. I found them in her art supplies after the funeral. I gave them to my mother to keep, along with other things I couldn't bear to look at. Dot kept them for me, along with letters from my teachers, and a locket Margaret left, and a journal documenting every moment of my childhood that someone bothered to notice and remember. The pain in my father's face was evident now. My mother always believed we should tell you the truth. She thought Margaret deserved to be remembered, that you deserved to know about her talents and dreams. But Linda and I were committed to the path we'd chosen. That path left me feeling like a stranger in my own family, I said. It left me thinking I was somehow less than Jessica, when the truth was just that I was different. I was half Mitchell and half something else that no one would acknowledge. Linda was crying now, tears streaming down her cheeks unchecked. I tried to love you exactly the same as Jessica. I tried so hard to make you feel like you belonged completely. But you're right, you were always looking for something I couldn't give you, because I wasn't the person who could give it to you. The weight of what she had attempted hit me fully for the first time. Linda had spent 31 years trying to fill a role she was never meant to play, trying to be Margaret for a daughter who had never known Margaret existed. She had attended school conferences and birthday parties and graduation ceremonies, always carrying the knowledge that she was standing in for someone else, someone whose absence shaped everything even though it was never acknowledged. I'm grateful for everything you did for me, I said, and I meant it, but I needed to know about Margaret. I needed to understand where my artistic abilities came from, why I always felt drawn to things you and Dad didn't understand. I needed to know that there was a reason I felt different. What happens now? Jessica asked. How do we move forward from here? It was a question none of us had an easy answer for. The truth was out now, but the relationships that had been built on partial information couldn't simply be reconstructed overnight. Linda was still the woman who had raised me, but she was no longer my mother in the biological sense I had always believed. My father was still my father, but he was also the man who had chosen to erase his first wife from family history. Jessica was still my sister, but we were half-sisters now, connected by one parent rather than two. I think we start by being honest, I said finally, about all of it, about Margaret, about the choices that were made, about how those choices affected all of us. And maybe we try to figure out how to honor Margaret's memory while building relationships based on truth instead of secrets. My father cleared his throat. There are more things, photos, letters, some of her artwork. I kept them in storage, thinking maybe someday. His voice trailed off. I'd like to see them, I said, all of them. I want to know who she was, not just how she died. Linda wiped her eyes and looked at me with an expression I had never seen before. Not maternal, exactly, but something more complex and honest. I'd like to know about her too. I've been living with her ghost for 30 years without ever learning who she really was. Maybe it's time I understood the woman whose daughter I've been trying to raise. The conversation continued for hours, moving from the living room to the kitchen, and eventually to the dining room where we ate a dinner that felt nothing like our usual family meals. We were no longer pretending to be something we weren't, no longer maintaining the careful fiction that had shaped our interactions for decades. Jessica asked questions I had never thought of. Margaret had wanted more children, what her relationship with Dot had been like, whether she had been happy during her brief marriage to our father. Linda shared observations she had been keeping to herself for years, ways that I reminded her of someone she had never met, talents that seemed to come from nowhere. Moments when my expressions or gestures had clearly triggered memories in my father that he couldn't or wouldn't explain. By the time we finally left that evening, we had all been fundamentally changed by the conversation. The family we had been that morning, father, mother, 2 daughters, no longer existed. In its place was something more complicated but more honest. A widowed father who had remarried. A stepmother who had done her best with an impossible situation, 1 biological daughter, and 1 daughter who was still figuring out what it meant to belong to multiple stories at once. The drive home was quiet, Jessica and I both processing the magnitude of what had just happened. Our family had been rebuilt on a foundation of truth instead of secrecy, but the structure was still unstable, still finding its new shape. "Are you okay?" Jessica asked as we pulled into my apartment complex. "I don't know," I said, honestly, "but I'm glad we finally know everything. I'm glad the secrets are finally out." She hugged me before I got out of the car, holding on tightly. "I love you, sister. Half-sister, step-sister, whatever we are, Mir. I love you too," I said, and for the first time in my adult life, the words felt uncomplicated by hidden dynamics or unspoken tensions. That night, I sat in my transformed apartment surrounded by Margaret's fairy tale illustrations, finally able to see them as they were meant to be seen, not as evidence of what I had lost, but as proof of what I had inherited. Margaret had died when I was 6 months old, but she had left me more than I had ever realized. Her artistic vision, her sensitivity to beauty, her desire to make the world more magical for children, these were all part of who I was. Gifts that had been waiting 32 years to be fully claimed and developed. The locket sat open on my coffee table, Margaret's serious eyes watching over the space where her daughter was finally truly coming home to herself. Part 10. The Breaking Point. The weeks following our family revelation brought unexpected challenges that none of us had anticipated. The truth, rather than immediately healing the wounds created by decades of secrecy, had initially made everything more complicated. Linda struggled with guilt about the choices she had made, while my father wrestled with grief he had buried for 30 years. Jessica found herself questioning every memory of our childhood, wondering what else might not be what it seemed. And I discovered that knowing the truth about Margaret didn't automatically resolve the identity crisis that had been brewing my entire life. The most difficult part was that the revelation had coincided with the worst period of my unemployment. As other people were celebrating new job offers or career advances, I was deconstructing my entire understanding of myself, while watching my savings account dwindle toward zero. The artistic awakening I had experienced through Margaret's illustrations felt like a luxury I couldn't afford, even though it also felt like the most important thing that had ever happened to me. I had started creating my own illustrations, inspired by Margaret's fairy tale paintings, but developing my own style and themes. The work felt more meaningful than anything I had ever done, but it wasn't paying rent or buying groceries. I was caught between the practical need to find another teaching position, and the growing conviction that my real calling lay in the artistic heritage Margaret had left me. The crisis came to a head on a gray October morning, when I received 2 pieces of mail that seemed to sum up the impossible choice I was facing. The first was a job offer from a school district 2 hours away, a full-time teaching position with benefits and stability, everything I thought I needed to get my life back on track.
The second was a letter from a children's book publisher in Columbus, who had somehow seen photographs of my work online and was interested in discussing a possible collaboration. I stared at both letters for a long time, understanding that this was the moment when I would have to choose between the safe path and the path that honored Margaret's legacy. The teaching job represented security and respectability, the kind of practical choice my father would approve of, and Linda would worry less about. The publisher's interest represented possibility and risk, the chance to pursue the artistic dreams that Margaret had never been able to fulfill. That evening I called Eleanor, needing to talk to someone who had known Margaret well enough to understand what she would have wanted for me. "She would have been so proud of your illustrations," Eleanor said after I explained the situation. "But more than that, she would have wanted you to be brave in ways she wasn't able to be. Margaret spent so much time trying to fit into other people's expectations that she never fully claimed her own artistic identity. Don't make the same mistake. But what if I fail? What if I'm not good enough to make a living as an artist?" Eleanor's voice was gentle but firm. "What if you are? What if this is exactly what Margaret hoped would happen when she painted those fairy tales for your nursery? What if her death wasn't meaningless but was the first step in a story that's still being written?" The conversation with Eleanor crystallized something that had been building in me for weeks. I wasn't just Sarah Mitchell anymore, the unemployed teacher who didn't quite fit in her own family. I was also Margaret's daughter, inheritor of artistic gifts and unfulfilled dreams, someone with the opportunity to honor her mother's memory by living the creative life she had never been able to pursue. I called the school district and politely declined their job offer. Then I called the publisher in Columbus and scheduled a meeting to discuss their interest in my work. The decision should have felt liberating, but instead it triggered the most intense period of anxiety I had ever experienced. Within days of committing to pursue art seriously, I was overcome with doubts that seemed to echo Margaret's own struggles with depression. What if I was making a terrible mistake? What if I ended up unemployed and unsuccessful, proving that my father had been right to prioritize stability over creativity? The fears became so overwhelming that I could barely sleep or eat. I found myself staring at Margaret's locket for hours, wondering if I was destined to repeat her pattern of struggling with feelings too big to manage. The depression that had claimed her life suddenly felt like a genetic inheritance I might not be able to escape, a darkness that artistic sensitivity might make worse rather than better. It was Jessica who finally intervened, arriving at my apartment one evening to find me sitting on the floor surrounded by crumpled sketches, convinced that nothing I created was good enough. "This is not what Margaret would have wanted," she said, settling beside me and gathering up the discarded drawings. "Look at these, Sarah. They're beautiful. They're unique. They're exactly the kind of work that publisher wants to see." She held up one of my illustrations, a princess who looked strong rather than helpless, standing in a garden where realistic wildflowers grew alongside impossible magical blooms. "You're not Margaret," Jessica continued. "You don't have to be afraid of the same things she was afraid of. You have advantages she didn't have, Maddie. You know about depression and how to get help for it. You have family support even if it's complicated. You have 32 years of life experience that she never got to have." Jessica's words broke through the panic that had been consuming me for weeks. She was right. I wasn't doomed to repeat Margaret's story. I could honor her memory while writing my own ending, could pursue the artistic path she had dreamed of while equipped with resources and knowledge she hadn't possessed. The meeting with the publisher exceeded my wildest expectations. They were interested in commissioning a series of illustrated children's books that would combine fairy tale elements with contemporary themes. Exactly the kind of work that felt like a natural extension of what Margaret had begun in her nursery paintings. The advance they offered wouldn't make me wealthy, but it would buy me time to develop my artistic career without the immediate pressure of financial desperation. As I signed the contract, I thought about the cardboard box at Dot's estate sale that had started this entire journey. Everyone else had walked past it, seeing only junk and clutter, but something had called to me about that box of Sarah's things. Now I understood that it hadn't been coincidence or luck that had drawn me to it. It had been Margaret's love, reaching across 32 years to guide her daughter toward the life she had always been meant to live. The first illustration I completed for the publisher was dedicated to Margaret Rose Mitchell, who painted fairy tales for a daughter she would never see grow up, and to Dorothy Mitchell, who made sure those fairy tales found their way home. It showed a young woman sitting in a garden, surrounded by the kind of magical flowers Margaret had loved to paint, reading to a child who was clearly meant to represent the daughter relationship that death had interrupted but love had preserved. When the book was published 6 months later, it became a local sensation in Cedar Falls. The Cedar Falls Gazette ran a feature story about the hometown girl who had discovered her artistic heritage and turned it into a career, and suddenly everyone wanted to know about the mysterious Margaret Mitchell, whose daughter had inherited her talent. Linda surprised me by being the book's most enthusiastic promoter, recommending it to everyone she met and displaying multiple copies in the family living room. "I'm so proud of you," she told me, and for the first time the words carried no complications or qualifications. She was proud of me for claiming Margaret's legacy while building something uniquely my own, for choosing courage over safety, for honoring the past while creating something new. My father's response was more complex but equally meaningful. He gave me a box of Margaret's belongings that he had kept in storage for 30 years, sketchbooks filled with her artwork, letters she had written to friends, photographs that showed her laughing and creating and living a full life before depression claimed her. Among the treasures was her easel, still bearing traces of paint from the last work she had been creating before I was born. "She would have wanted you to have this," he said, setting up the easel in the spare room of my apartment that I had converted into a studio. "She would have wanted you to use it to create the art she never got to finish." But perhaps the most meaningful response came from an unexpected source. A week after the book's publication, I received a handwritten note from James Peterson, the boy who had stood close to Margaret in the high school drama club photograph. "I saw the article about your book," he wrote. "I've been living in Denver for 20 years, but I still get the hometown newspaper. I wanted you to know that your mother was the most genuinely creative person I knew in high school. She saw magic in ordinary things, and she made everyone around her see it too. I'm not surprised her daughter inherited that gift. Margaret would be so proud of what you've accomplished." The note included his phone number, and an invitation to call if I ever wanted to hear stories about Margaret's teenage years. It was another piece of the puzzle, another connection to the mother I was still getting to know through the memories of people who had loved her. As I sat in my studio that evening, working on illustrations for the second book in what was becoming a successful series, I realized that I had finally found my place in the story. I was no longer the Mitchell family's afterthought or the daughter who had never quite fit in. I was Margaret's child and Linda's daughter and Dot's beloved granddaughter, someone who carried multiple legacies and had learned to weave them into something uniquely my own. The locket sat open on my desk as I worked, Margaret's serious eyes watching over the art that was finally fulfilling the dreams she had painted in those fairy tale illustrations 32 years ago. I was living the life she had imagined for us both, creating beauty for children, and honoring the creative spirit that had been my birthright all along. The box from Dot's estate sale had been labeled Sarah's Things, and now I understood why. Everything in it, the letters, the journal, the key that led to the locket, had been tools to help me discover who I really was and what I was meant to become. Dot had been saving more than Margaret's memory. She had been preserving a destiny that was always meant to be mine. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.